This is Dr. Rebecca Johansson, running and triathlon coach with the Performance Project. And this is the Pacing Strategy webinar. We're going to start off by talking about the different types of pacing profiles that can happen throughout a race. So we're going to talk about 4 different profiles. On the x-axis, we have race distance in kilometers, and for simplicity's sake, all 4 of these situations are going to be, for example, half marathon race. And on the y-axis, we have running speed in kilometers per hour. So the first pacing profile is called a positive pacing profile. And in this situation, running speed would get slower as the race goes on. So if you compare first half to second half, the second half would be slower than the first half. The second pacing profile is a negative pacing. And in this situation, running speed increases as the race distance goes on. The third one is a variable pacing profile. And in this pacing profile, there would be no evident trend in pacing as the distance goes on. It would be variable speed at all different points in the race. And the fourth one is parabolic pacing profile. And there's a number of different curves that you can see in this one, but the one I drew would be an example where running speed at the beginning would be quite fast, relatively fast, and then running speed decreases in the middle parts of the race, and then at the end of the race, running speed increases again. So this would be, this often happens in instances where there's some strategy being employed to get a high position, a high placing at a race. So at the beginning, you're fighting to get into a good pace bus or a good pacing pack and to find a nice position in the race. And then you settle into a more slower pace, and then at the end you're increasing your race speed to try and pass other competitors for a competitive finish. We're going to talk about half marathon pacing first, and this graph is from a study from 2015 from Dr. Hanley's group, and he publishes a lot of papers on running pace and is an expert in the field. And this paper was determining pacing profiles in pack running at 6 different IAAF World Half Marathon champs, so professional or elite level runners. And this graph that I have up on this screen is from the women. So they looked at both the men and the women. And on the x-axis, they have distance completed. So it's a half marathon. So we've got, they had pacing at 5, 10, 15, 20 Ks, and then that last 1.1 Ks of the race. And then on the y-axis, they have running speed in kilometers per hour. So the mean speed for whichever segment they're discussing at the time. So they had 5 different groups. The medalists were the top 18 finishers. And then how they came up with the percentages for the other groups was that was just a percentage of the winning time. So in the less than 5% group, their finishing times were less than 5% slower than the winning time. And then so on, down to 16 to 25%. And then people who were slower than that were excluded from the study. So the easiest way to look at these types of graphs and identify differences is to look at the medalists versus the slowest group, the 16 to 25%. And the main takeaways from this graph is that the medalists, or the fastest runners at the IAAF World Champs, have more even pacing profile compared to the slowest runners who had finishing times 16 to 25% slower than the winning time. So this is absolute speed, but we can see in the medalists from the 5K mark to the 20K mark, they're slowing down about half a kilometer per hour, which is really not that much. And then they have a finishing burst, which every group did have. But then when you compare that to the 16 to 25% group, the 16 to 25% group slowed from about 16.75 kilometers per hour at the 5K mark to just above 15. So they slowed a lot more in terms of absolute speed from the 5K mark to the 20K mark. So the takeaway from this and the application to the recreational level would be that a more even pacing profile at the half marathon distance would lead to a faster performance. The other interesting thing that they did in this study was they looked at the pack profiles. So they had 6 different groups. The ever-present group was the group of runners that stayed in a pack throughout the whole race, and they stayed in the same pack of runners throughout the whole race. The nomadic ones were ones that were always in a pack, but the people that were in that pack changed throughout the race. The halfway group were in a pack up until the halfway point of the race, and then they ran solo for the second half. The solo group didn't run in a pack for the entire duration of the half marathon. The regroupers were the ones that were in a pack at the 5K mark, then ran solo, and then joined a group at the end. And then the short-lived ones were in a pack at the 5K mark and then were running solo for the rest of the race. And what we see from this graph is that the people who did the best or maintained the most even pacing throughout the race was the ever-present group. So this would be an argument that running in a pack, particularly a pack that is well suited to your potential on race day, will help you achieve better performances. And then the people who slowed down the most throughout the race was the short-lived group, the regroupers, and shortly above that was the solo group. So the people who didn't spend very much time in a pack slowed down more throughout the race compared to people who spent a majority of the race in a pack. So this, at the recreational level, this would be an argument for choosing a pace bus that is well suited to your potential on race day, or targeting a group of runners or competitors who you know have similar potential to you, and running in that pack will help you achieve better performances compared to if you ran solo. Now we're going to move on to the marathon distance. And this is from a YouTube lecture from Dr. Steven Seiler, and I really like his research because it's very applicable to running performances and coaching science. And this graph is about predicting marathon time. So I get this question all the time from runners, Rebecca, what time can I target for a marathon race? So this would be an instance where we can use a 5K or 10K time, even a half marathon time, to try and predict what your potential at the marathon would be. So this was quite high level runners. This was, they looked at top 500 performances on the IAAF website. And the requirement was the runners had to have run all 4 distances, 5K, 10K, half marathon, and marathon, all within one season. So what he ended up with was 37 males and 75 females. And then they found a very close association, a close relationship between these race distances. And so what you come up with is a formula to predict marathon or half marathon times from shorter races. So this table really helps apply that formula in a much easier and applied way. So basically it's ratios. So if we look at the far right column, 5K in ratio to the marathon. So for both males and females, that ratio is about 1.13. So for example, if your best 5K time right now is 20 minutes, that would be a pace of 4 minutes per K, or in imperial 629 minute miles. And then the estimated marathon pace that you could hold if that was your best 5K time would be 431 per K or 719s per mile, which ends up being a 311 marathon time. So the caveat here is that these are high level runners, and just because your predicted marathon potential is 311 doesn't necessarily mean that you can achieve that time in the same year. And at the recreational level, the overwhelming reason for that is that you just haven't achieved the training load that's required to hit your best marathon time that year. So it takes, generally at the recreational level, it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years to reach your marathon potential, both because it takes a while for your body to get used to the amount of training that's required for a competitive marathon, and also it takes experience. You need to run a few marathons before you really understand how to keep an even pace throughout the marathon. And Dr. Seiler also looked at marathon pacing. So he plotted all the participants. He posted on Twitter and said, hey, if you've run a marathon, can you send me your GPS data for pace and heart rate, if they had a chest strap for a heart rate monitor. And they were recreational levels, but they were high level. So I think the majority of them had anywhere from a 2:12 to a 2:30 marathon time, but the slowest one was 4 hours. So very high level. I would categorize them as sub-elite recreational runners. So the top graph was looking at percent of max heart rate, and on the x-axis that is percent of time, percent of marathon time. And what he found was that in these high-level recreational runners for the marathon, they averaged anywhere from 87 to 90% of max heart rate. And once they reached about 60% of their marathon time, the heart rate starts to drift upward, which is called cardiac drift, and that's a physiological phenomenon that we see in all athletes as they do endurance running events. And the main reason for that is a decrease in plasma volume. So we would expect to see that drift in heart rate, but the main takeaway from that is the 87 to 90% of max heart rate. And that's something that if you know your max heart rate, you can calculate that. And if you run with a chest strap heart rate monitor, that's just one tool that you can use to sort of see, okay, am I in sort of the right range in terms of heart rate? But I wouldn't race or train by heart rate. It's just a nice metric to have to take into account along with running pace and your RPE, your rating of perceived effort. And then the graph on the bottom is the percent of lactate threshold pace. And the nice thing about this is what he found was that in these runners, they held about an average of 93% of lactate threshold pace. And then in the last 15% of race time, the pace slows down a bit and it goes down to about 90% of lactate threshold pace. So there's really two takeaways from that graph. One is that you can easily predict what your lactate threshold pace is. So in terms of a good scientific estimate, it would be a pace that you could hold in a race situation for approximately 60 minutes. So if your best 10K time is 40 minutes or slower, a best 10K race time, your pace for that race would be a pretty good predictor of what your lactate threshold pace is. If your 10K time, race time, is faster than 40 minutes, then you should rather take your pace for a best 15K race, and that's a better predictor of your lactate threshold pace. So you can calculate out what 90 to 93% of that lactate threshold pace is, and you can say, okay, on your very best, if you're reaching your potential, you could possibly hold 90% of that pace. But again, these are very high level runners, and that's not going to be possible for everybody. So he really ended up splitting the marathon into 3 phases. The first phase would be the first 50 to 60% of race time, where you're holding a stable pace and a stable heart rate. And then phase 2, from about halfway, your heart rate's going to start to drift up, which is common, but the pace is maintained. But the key takeaway here is that basically from about halfway, your RPE is going to go up a little bit. So your perceived effort, even though the pace is the same, the perceived effort will go up a little bit. So that's a common and that's a normal feeling. Then phase 3 would be what he deemed to be, hitting the wall, but I don't really like that term. So heart rate will keep climbing, and then running pace will typically fade a little or a lot. So the goal would be in that last 15% of race time for pace to only fade a little. And tactics that we can use to help guarantee that pace only fades a little, or maybe even maintain pace for that last 15% of race time, would be a good pacing strategy from the beginning, running in a good pack if in a race situation, and number 3, having a good nutrition strategy that you've already practiced and that you're executing well throughout the race so that your glycogen levels stay consistent and you don't get a drop in your blood sugar. So that's both good summary of half marathon and marathon pacing. But if you only just take one lesson away from it, both the half marathon and the marathon are endurance running events, and the goal is to maintain an even pace, or as even as possible pace, throughout the race.